And I'm going to hand it over to my coworker, Clare O'Keefe, who is a digital accessibility consulting engineer here at Stanford.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. So thank you, everyone, for joining today. I'm going to be talking about all about accessible names. So if you've learned anything about accessibility so far, or if you've worked with our office, the Office of Digital Accessibility, or maybe you've gotten a accessibility assessment from us or from another vendor or some other accessibility consultant, you may have heard discussion around accessible name, but you may not fully understand that concept and what it means and sort of all the considerations that go into it. So I wanted to do this presentation to sort of give more of an overview and some detail about what accessible name means. So what we're going to cover is, what does accessible name mean? When do you need to provide one for elements? Different ways that you can name elements and how the name is computed or calculated. We will go over some naming rules and guidelines to assist you when you may need to provide accessible names for things. How to check the name if maybe you're testing something or looking into someone else's code and are not sure what the accessible name of something is. We'll give you some tips on how to actually check that and verify it. And I'll do a demo at the end of some different things that are named in different ways, and also how to do that checking on how the name is calculated. So again, let's start with, what does it really mean when we say accessible name? So what this really means is, it's the definition of it, we'll say, is it's the name of a user interface element. That's kind of technical. And you might not know what exactly is that referring to. So what does that mean? Are we talking about what an element is? Is it a link or a button? Are we talking about what it does, what action it performs? Are we talking about the HTML tag that actually makes up the element that we're looking at? And here's some example, what we might call user interface elements. These are things taken from various websites. And we've got a few things going on. We've got what looks like a search bar or a search field, a navigation area with some links and buttons, something else that looks like a button that says load more news, something that looks like a link for prospective students FAQ, and an image. So all of these things are user interface elements that you may see on a website. You'll see lots of things like this on websites. So what are these things, and what do they do, and how would we name them? What would we say their names are? But let's first go over what an accessible name is not. So when we talk about accessible name, we're not talking about the HTML element that is used. So we're not talking about, this is a button element, this is an anchor element, or an image element, or an input. That's not what the name is. It's also not the role of the element. So we're not talking about, it's a button, it's a link, it's an image, it's a tab, it's a text box. That's not what the name is either. Those identify sort of the role of the element, what it does. And we're also not talking about the state of it. So you can have controls that might be selected or not selected, expanded or collapsed, pressed or not pressed. So that's the state. That's, again, not the name of an element. So let's talk about what name really is. What does that mean? So it's essentially what text identifier you would assign to an element. And a lot of elements on a web page are often sort of named by default without a whole lot of thought going into it. So if you have links that have text inside of them, or buttons that have text inside of them, the text that's inside the button or the link is usually going to be the accessible name. So if you have like a FAQs link, and you have the text FAQ inside of it, that's going to be the accessible name usually, if you haven't done anything different to it. So going back to the examples that we looked at before, what are the accessible names for these things? So we have a search box and it has a label. And so the accessible name of the search box is search this site. We have a load more news control, which based on appearance, it could be a link, it could be a button. We'd have to dig into the code, but its name looks like it's going to be load more news. Again, a link that says prospective students FAQ looks like the name of that is exactly matching the visible text, prospective students FAQ. Then we've got an image. So images can have an accessible name as well, which is typically provided via the alt attribute. So if we had an alt on this and we called it Hoover Tower, then Hoover Tower is the accessible name of the image. And then the one above that is, I'm not necessarily talking about the links and buttons that are shown there, but this thing as a whole is a navigation area on a website. And so that navigation area itself can have a name. And this one is called main menu. And then the links inside of that would have their own, separate individual accessible names. So what's the purpose of an accessible name? Well, it really creates what we'll say is a machine perceivable label text string. And that text string can be used to create alternative presentations of the content or the element. So for example, that machine perceivable label text string could be used by screen readers or Braille display in order to provide information about that element to someone using that assistive technology. So if it's a non-visual user who can't visibly see the element, they can still find out what it is. It'll tell us more information about the element, what's its purpose, what outcome we can expect when we interact with it, as long as we've given it a meaningful accessible name. So the example here, we have a submit, what looks like a submit button. So the name is submit. It is a button, that's its role, but the name of it is submit. So when do you need to provide accessible names for user interface elements? So they're definitely required when you're using native HTML interactive controls, things like input elements, link elements, anchor elements, buttons, text areas, select, field set, details. These are all interactive controls or related to interactive controls. And they need to have a name so that people can, let's say someone uses a screen reader, can hear what it is. What is the purpose of this? Okay, it's a button, but what does it do? Okay, it's a link, but what does it do? It needs a name. Same when putting images on a page. So whether it's the IMG element or an SVG, if they're meaningful and provide, important information on the website, then they need to have accessible names as well, so that information can be conveyed. Now, like I mentioned before, if you have a navigation area, you can give a name to that. If you only have one nav on a page, you don't necessarily need to give it an accessible name because it's the only one, and so you'll assume that it's the main navigation. But you may have multiple navs on a page. Let's say you have a real, global navigation at the very top, and then a more, sub-site specific navigation beneath it, and maybe a left nav as well. So if you put each of those into a nav element, you'd want to label them to make them distinguishable. If someone's using a screen reader, they'd be able to tell what's the purpose of this particular nav that I'm in. Similarly, if you have multiple footers or multiple asides, you'd want to label them, give them an accessible name so that people can tell them apart. When you are creating dialogue elements, those always need to be labeled. Again, this goes to particularly screen reader use. If someone opens a dialogue, then the screen reader will announce that it's a dialogue and will announce the accessible name if it's there. And that's very helpful for determining, what has happened. Am I in the right dialogue? Am I seeing the information I expected? You can give accessible names to section elements. Sometimes this is a good idea, but if you have a web page with a lot of sections on it, then it can become a little bit of overload. So case-by-case basis on section elements. And then when we talk about ARIA, and ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. So this is additional markup that you can put into your code to provide additional accessibility information. So let's say you could take a div and give it role equals button, and it is now perceived as a button by assistive technology. So if you're using ARIA, any of these ARIA roles, this full list, and this is not a complete list on the screen, but this is, a subset of the ARIA roles that can be given accessible names. And then the ones that are starred require accessible names. They must be named. So things like button, checkbox, column header, combo box, dialog, heading, radio, list box, slider, those things require names. Most of those are interactive elements. So like native HTML interactive elements, then the ARIA roles that are interactive really need to have it as well. And something like heading is not interactive, but you wouldn't expect a heading to have no content, no text, no label associated with it. So a heading has to have an accessible name, otherwise you really have no text to go along with it. So how can we, what are the methods of naming things? And how is the name computed or calculated? So there are multiple ways that you can name something. The first one is the element gets its name from its content, from the content or the text value that's within the element itself. So like we talked about before, a link or a button that has text inside of it, that can be labeled from the content within it. So if it's a link that says click here, that text is inside of the link element and that becomes the accessible name. But it can also be given in an additional way from you authoring it or someone else, adding additional explicit markup to give it that accessible name. And this can happen in the case of a label element that's associated with a form field. So you would have a label and give it a for attribute and reference the ID of an input that you're trying to label. So that's an explicit markup association to provide that label. Another way is the aria-label attribute, which can be put on interactive elements and some static roles as well. So that can provide a name. The aria-labelledby attribute can be used to reference content in other areas of the page to give a name. I mentioned alt earlier, so if you want to give an accessible name to an image, you're going to use the alt attribute and put some text inside there. And some elements can be labeled by the title attribute as well. So the name calculation is a process that's done by the user agent or the browser. So the browser has to go through all of the elements and determine what is the name of it. And it's an algorithm that it goes through, and that computation takes into account whether the element can be named from content. Does it have content within it? Is there other markup that can provide a name like aria-label or aria-labelledby? And when there are potentially multiple sources of name, maybe it has content within it and it has an aria-label or an aria-labelledby, then there's a sort of a priority order that's gone through in order to determine what is going to be the actual accessible name for this element. So this gives a simplification of the name calculation algorithm. And this tells you, the order of precedence, we'll say. So if an element can be named and it has aria-labelledby, then that is the one that trumps everything else. Whether the thing has text inside of it or an aria-labelledby always wins. That's the top of the chain. If it has an aria-label but no aria-labelledby, then aria-label wins. Then that would replace any inner text or a label element. So if it's an input field and you associated it with a label element, but you also gave it an aria-label, that trumps. So it sort of goes through in a recursive fashion and looks for all of the potential ways that it could be named and determines which one has priority. And then that is what will be conveyed to the accessibility API and then conveyed through assistive technology, such as a screen reader, to determine what is actually announced to users. So let's go through some examples and just see, based on that algorithm, what would win? What would be the accessible name of this? So for example 1, we've got a link with the text "contact us" inside. Okay, so there's nothing else that could potentially provide an accessible name or label to this. So the inner content is going to win. So it's just going to be the accessible name is "contact us." Example 2, we've got the text "contact us" again inside the link, but we also have aria-label that says "reach us." So in this case, aria-label trumps inner content. So the accessible name of this is now going to be reach us, not contact us. For example 3, again, we've got the same kind of link with contact us as the text, but it has a title attribute. But going back to our previous slide of the order, title is number 10, and inner text content is 9. So the inner text content wins. It's going to be contact us, not chat with us. And then the most complex one that we've got as an example here is, again, a link that has visible text of contact us, but then it has an ARIA label. Let me just turn on a pen to make this a little bit easier to follow. Okay, so we've got contact us as the inner text, but then we've got an ARIA label of reach us. Okay, so that trumps contact us. Oh, but then we have aria-labeled by, and this references this down here. So aria-labeled by beats aria-label and inner text content. So now we've confused things, but the browser could read this and figure out the label is going to be connect with us, regardless of what was visible, which was contact us, and regardless of the ARIA label, reach us. ARIA labeled by wins, so the accessible name for this is going to be connect with us. Let's take another example using form fields. So we've got a text input for all 3 of these examples. And in the first one, we've got, this is the sort of simplest example. We've got the input, and then we have a label that is properly associated with it using matching for and ID attributes. So this text input is going to be called first name. That's the accessible name. But then the second example, again, we have label and input. Those are associated properly, but we put an ARIA label on the input. So that wins. Now it's going to be called middle name, not first name. It disregards the label because ARIA label is higher in the priority order. And you can see where I'm going with this probably. Again, in the next one, we've got another input, same as before, properly associated label element. We've got an ARIA label of middle name, but ARIA labeled by came in to reference this span. Now this text input is going to be called last name, not first name, not middle name. It's going to be last name. So let's go over some naming rules and guidelines. So we don't want to necessarily have that kind of conflict going on all the time, but sometimes it's necessary to override the visible label with something more descriptive, or you may need to pull from multiple areas to label something. So let's talk about methods of labeling and best practices. So if you have an input and you're trying to label it with multiple sources, like in this example, we've got a text input, and I want to indicate that this text input is for the date of birth and the month you were born. So it does not work to use 2 label elements to associate 2 label elements with 1 input. That's not going to work. It's not allowed. So assistive tech, the browser is going to, look at them both and kind of pick one, and then the assistive technology will probably just render one of them. Which one, you cannot necessarily be sure. So it's either going to be labeled as date of birth or month, but you're not going to hear both of them. This kind of dual association with 2 labels doesn't work. So in a case like that, you can make use of, this is where aria-labeled by comes in handy, because I want to label that text input with 2 different pieces of information, but I can't use 2 label elements. So instead, I can do aria-labeled by. And rather than having 2 labels, now I've got 2 spans, and the aria-labeled by attribute can reference both of those spans. You can put in multiple IDs as the value for aria-labeled by. So now it's pulling in the content from this span and the content from this span. So now the text input will be labeled date of birth, month. And something to keep in mind, which some people who are new to using aria-label are not aware of this, but the way aria-label works is that it does not get appended to the inner text of something. So we have a link here that says read more. Now you can't use aria-label to just add information after read more. You can't use it to add about upcoming events to that. The aria-label will fully overtake the inner text content. So if you still wanted read more to be part of this, then you would have to put the whole thing inside the aria-label. So that it would be read more about upcoming events. You would not get that same kind of announcement if you only put about upcoming events in the aria-label. The accessible name for that would just be about upcoming events, and you wouldn't hear read more. Another way that you can sort of supplement the accessible name for something is by using off-screen text. So you can put, a span inside of a link or a button and with additional text and hide that off screen. Not, you wouldn't use display none, but you would position it off screen. So this text would not be visible on the screen, but it would become part of the accessible name. So now the algorithm will go through and it will pick up the inner text content of read more, as well as the content of this span. So the accessible name will have both of those, and it will be read more about upcoming events. This is a good way to provide supplementary information to a link without necessarily having to put it on the screen. And something to keep in mind is that CSS pseudo elements such as before and after, any content, if you put CSS content in there, that will be included in the accessible name calculation. So you need to be careful and intentional about how you use this. So I've got an example here, which I'll show in the demo actually as well, of a button that has the text hide section, but it also had a little dash next to it to kind of indicate, give a little icon indication as well that you're going to hide it. So it says hide section and it has a little dash next to it. And that dash was inserted through CSS, through the content property. And when I encountered this and I tested it with the JAWS screen reader, it announces as hide section and dash, which is not probably the behavior that people were going for when they created this. Now, the behavior of different screen readers can vary a bit. I actually tested the same thing with NVDA, another Windows screen reader, and it does not read the dash. But knowing this, just be careful about what you put in, what you inject with CSS content, because it could very well come through and be included in the accessible name. So a better way to do something like this would be to, put it in a span that's then hidden with like aria hidden equals true, or you might use an SVG to put it in and then hide the SVG from assistive technology, again with aria hidden. But yeah, be thoughtful about what you're injecting with CSS content because it is included in the name calculation. And this is related to what I was talking about before. Labeling, this is a WCAG success criteria about label in name. And that's that accessible names should match or include the visible label. So if you have a link that says read more, but you want to do the right thing and give some more descriptive information about where that goes, then you can use aria-label to do that. But you want to be careful not to have it be aria-label of just upcoming events. That text of read more needs to be part of it. And this goes to particularly how speech recognition assistive technology users operate. They would be controlling the computer and browsing using voice commands. And they are not going to see the underlying aria-label code. They're just going to see a link titled read more. And they may voice a command like click read more. But if the aria-label is only upcoming events, then their assistive technology doesn't see a link called read more, and that command won't work. So you need to include the visible text inside of the accessible name. so that it could be read more about upcoming events. Not just upcoming events, include that visible text. Another thing is to avoid excessively long accessible names. So I've got an example here of a typical card. I think this was something from the Stanford alumni site, and this is done well, but I'm just using this as an example. How much of the text of this card do you want to include in the accessible name? Let's say this is a link. How much of the text should be inside the link? If you put all of this in there, you've got a little podcast icon, you've got a sort of title of the article or the podcast, you've got an icon that indicates an external link, you've got information about where this came from Stanford Pathfinders, and then you've got 2 sentences about the contents of the podcast. So putting all of that inside of the link and having it be the accessible name is probably going to be a little too verbose. So you want to be careful about how much text really goes in there, because a screen reader user is going to have to hear all of that at once if they're navigating through links like this. So probably you're just going to do the top part, the title. Now, there are different ways to check the accessible name. Maybe you're coding something and you want to be sure about how it's going to announce what is going to be the actual accessible name, or maybe you're checking something that somebody else did. There are different ways that you can check the accessible name. So a couple tools you can use are, you can use a screen reader. Now there's caution with that because some screen readers will do their best to compensate for maybe not the best code, or they'll behave in slightly different ways. So for example, if I was navigating with the JAWS screen reader and it comes across unlabeled form fields, it'll do its best to guess at a label. If there's nearby text that seems like it would be a label for that field, it will often just go ahead and guess it's the label and announce it. So you need to be a little bit careful and if you're testing only with a screen reader, because particularly for things like form fields, the assistive technology can try to guess, but it's sometimes useful if you're navigating through a page, you can hear something that doesn't announce correctly. You can say, there's something confusing going on here. You can also check with Chrome DevTools. There's an accessibility pane where you can look it up and see what's the accessible name. Chrome DevTools has another view that you can look at called the accessibility tree view, which will give you the same information, just formatted slightly differently. Firefox DevTools has an accessibility tree view as well, very similar to Chrome. There's a tool called Andy, which stands for Accessible Name and Description Inspector. This is a tool put out by the Social Security Administration. It's a handy tool for testing a number of things regarding accessibility, but this is just one aspect that you can use it for, which is checking the accessible name of things. It does plenty of other cool stuff as well. And then there's a very simple web tool called the ACNAME prototype test, which I'll include a link to in the last slide of this. So when it's posted online, you can get to it from there, where you can basically paste some code in and then run it, and it will tell you the accessible name. And I'll demo these things. So you can check with the screen reader, like I said. You can navigate to a control, either arrowing down, tab to it, or you can use something like pulling up a list of elements. I've got a screenshot here of the NVDA elements list, and it's showing the list of links on the page. So that's one. So this list will show you the links and as their accessible name has been calculated. So the list of links that you're seeing is showing you all the accessible names for the links on the page. So you may see something there that doesn't look right, is not descriptive, or it might say blank or something like that, and you have a problem. So you can either listen to the screen reader or you can use a tool, built-in tool of the screen reader, like pulling up the elements list. So here's a screenshot of the Chrome developer tools, the accessibility pane. And I'll show you how to get to this so it's a little more clear, but you can see that we're looking at a link because it actually says role link and then where it says name, and it shows you alumni directory external link. And you can actually see it's showing you where did it come from. It's coming from contents. It's not coming from aria-labelledby because that's not specified. It's not coming from aria-label because that's not specified. It's coming from contents. So that's kind of cool. You can actually see where the name is coming from. And then here's the accessibility tree view in Chrome. So again, you can right click on an element, inspect it while you're inspecting, and I'll demo this. You want to make sure you're focused on the actual interactive element or the landmark or whatever you are trying to determine the name of. And then look in the tree view and it will similarly show you in quotation marks what the name is. I was looking at the same link here. So again, it shows alumni directory external link. And here's what Andy looks like. So if we go to a page and launch Andy, which is like a little favelet or bookmarklet, it injects itself at the top of the page. And then you can use Andy by hovering over a link or tabbing to it. And then you can look at what the Andy output is. So whatever the Andy output is, that's what the accessible name is. And actually this tells us as well, where did the name come from? It came from inner text. All right, let's do some demoing. So I set up this little, this little test page. And I'm going to turn on the screen reader. So I'm going to turn on JAWS so that we can actually hear what some of these things sound like. Once I've got that turned on, then I'll send the sound through.
All about accessible names.pptx-PowerPoint presenter view.
All right. Are you hearing the sound, Kevin?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Leaving menus, F5, act name demos, page has to react name.
So I'm going to have to sort of stop the screen reader from talking, and you'll hear it in fits and starts because you won't be able to hear me talking over it. So I'm going to navigate through this page and see, as I tab through things, what do they sound like versus what do they look like? Actually, I'll arrow down first.
Primary navigation region.
Oh, so you heard primary navigation region. So I actually put in a nav element into this page, and I gave it an aria label of primary navigation.
Act name primary navigation
Yeah, so
region.
I gave it a name of primary, and the screen reader announces navigation because it's a navigation, it's a nav element. So we heard a name for that.
Primary navigation region. Menu button collapsed to activate, press enter.
Menu button collapsed. So I heard menu, which is the name, button, which is the role, collapsed, which is the state. So menu is the important part we're talking about. That's the name of it.
Enter, expanded.
And it told me that it's expanded. Now let's go through. So I've got a hypothetical list of navigation links here. Let's tab through these.
List with 3 items. Home link.
Okay, so that matches what it says visibly.
About link.
About link, that's matching.
Talk to us link.
Visibly it says contact us, but it said talk to us. So I've done something in the code so that the visible text is no longer what's being rendered.
List with 4 items. Contact us link.
This is, sort of correlates, I think, to one of the examples from the slides. I've given a series of 4 links. I've labeled them or given them names in different ways. So contact us. Let me go through that again.
List with 4 items. Contact us link.
That one matches the text.
Reach us link.
Now it says reach us, even though visibly it says contact us.
Contact us link. Chat with us.
Now that said contact us, chat with us. So we'll look in the code and see what I did.
Connect with us link.
Now that one says connect with us. So I think I used aria-labelledby on that one. Let's go ahead and let me turn off the speech for a second.
Space, speech on demand.
All right, let's look at what I did here. Make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so let's go through these links. So the first one, this is pretty much what I showed in the slide. It just says contact us, that's the name. But then I gave it an aria label on the second one that says reach us, so that became the name. In the third one, I gave it a title attribute. So contact us is the name, and the title attribute actually becomes the accessible description, which is sort of beyond the scope of this presentation, but there's also an algorithm for calculating the accessible description of something. So contact us is the name, chat with us becomes the description. And then in the last one, I used aria-labelledby to reference that bit of text underneath the list that says connect with us. So now the name of this becomes connect with us. Oh, let me turn the speech back on.
Full speech. First name edit, type in
Okay,
text.
now we have a text field that says first name.
Middle name edit, type in
This
text.
is like I did in the slide. Now it says first name, but it's actually middle name because I gave it an aria label.
Last name edit, type in
And
text.
now it says last name because I used aria-labelledby to reference that text.
Act name demos. Date of birthday edit, type
Now
in
this
text.
is using that aria-labelledby strategy. I want to label these fields uniquely because there's 3 fields and I don't want them to all be labeled date of birth. I want them to say which one is day, which one is month, which one is year. So I've used aria-labelledby to reference both the text date of birth and either day or month or year. So you heard date of birth, day.
Date of birth month edit, type in
Date of birth,
text.
month.
Date of birth year edit, type in
There we
text.
go.
List with 3 items about upcoming events link.
And this is getting to the, how does aria-label work? Let's look at this one.
Main toolbar elements. Space, speech on
I'll just
demand.
here for a second. Again, see, this is demonstrating how it works when you have aria-label. It only read about upcoming events. It didn't read the read more text because the aria-label overtakes the inner text. Let me go back through these.
Full speech. List with 3 items. Read more about upcoming events link.
That's good.
Learn more about our office link.
Learn more about our office. In this one, we used screen reader only text. Now I'll show you the funny thing that happened with the end dash.
Hide section end dash button expanded to activate. Press
Yeah,
enter.
so it's kind of confusing. End dash. I mean, you'd have to interpret what that means. That doesn't mean anything to a non-visual person. So you'd want to try and not have that happen. And then we're talking about the example of sort of an article card and how much of the text you really want to include in the accessible name or of the link.
Podcast : Disrupting Life Insurance. Left parent external link. Right parent from Stanford Pathfinders co-founder and CEO Peter Collis, MBA 16, discusses the purpose of his company Ethos Life. Collis and his partner.
I'm going to stop it. But you'd have to hear all of that when you tab to something to try and figure out what's the purpose of this link. It's a bit much. You would really only want to have it read like the name of it and that it's a podcast and that it's an external link, like the second example.
Podcast : Disrupting Life Insurance. Left parent external link. Right parent heading level 3 link. Robert has left the meeting.
That's all we really needed. Okay, so those are those examples, and let me show you the tools I mentioned of how to check the
Main
name.
toolbar
Let me
element.
turn off
Space, speech on demand.
All right, so we're going to look at, let's look at contact us or, okay, so I've right-clicked on that and gone to inspect. I'm focused on this. You want to make sure you're not focused on like the list item. You need to be focused on the correct element in the elements pane. And then down here next to where you would look at CSS and event listeners, further over, there's an accessibility tab. So now let's scroll down a little bit. Here's the name, Connect with Us. And it's coming from aria-labelledby. It shows that it had content of contact us, but it's crossed out because something else took precedence. And it had an aria label, but it's crossed out because aria-labelledby took precedence. So there's this view, and you can also not seeing my usual. Usually there's a little person icon to get to the tree view. Not seeing it right now. I think I might need to turn it on. But there's usually a little person icon so that you can get to the tree view. But I'll show you, basically it looks exactly the same in Firefox. Okay, I'm focused on the link. This is the accessibility tree view. I need to turn off JAWS, sorry. Slowing everything down a little bit. Wait while my PC recovers from that. Okay, here we go. Actually, you can use the same type of thing you have in the regular Elements Inspector. You can use this little tool at the top left to highlight the thing you want to look at. Click on it. Okay. So now this is the tree view. Let me try and make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So this is showing you basically a tree view of all the stuff that's on the page. I'm in a list, multiple list items. Within this list item, there's a link, and the text that's in quotations is the accessible name. And you can see it down here as well. Name, connect with us. Also tells you the role, other cool stuff like that. Let me show you Andy, which I'm going to do in Chrome. All right, so this is a little bookmark that I've saved. So once you've got Andy started, then make sure you've got the focusable elements active in this dropdown, which I currently do, and then you can just hover over things, or you could tab to them. So I'm currently hovered over a contact, what looks like a contact link, but the Andy output shows us that the accessible name is Talk to Us. And it shows you here, where did it come from? From aria-label. It had inner text, but aria-label wins. So there's that. And then the final tool is this ACNAME demo, which, like I said, is going to be linked in the presentation, so you can get it if you look at the presentation after. And this is where you can just paste in some code. So if I want to check this particular link, I'll copy it from here, paste it into here. You do need to add an ID of test to this. There's a handy button. This is just how the test runs. So it needs to have an ID on it, because you could be pasting loads of content in here. So the ID equals test is telling it which part do you want it to look at. So I want it to look at this particular link with the ID of test, and then you hit paste and test, and now it tells you ACNAME equals Talk to Us. It would also tell you the accessible description if there was one. This doesn't have anything. All right, so those are the tools that you can use for testing. Let me go back to presentation. Now, that pretty much wraps me up. Were there any questions?
None in the chat so far.
Okay. Anything you care to add, Kevin? Kevin's my colleague and he knows just as much or more than me.
The only thing I was going to mention was that there's also an aria described by that Claire didn't talk about, which is not the accessible name. You can't confuse those two. They're not the same thing. It's adds on, just like the title does, not replace or become part of the calculable accessible name. It's just an add-on thing. So
yeah. So there's, like I said, there's accessible name and then there's accessible description. It's sort of two separate algorithms. But if you had something with a name and a description, then the screen reader would announce both things.
Right.
I have a question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, hi, I have a question, Claire. Sometimes, you were saying which one it was picking up as the name, and it was kind of different to say, what was being displayed, but it was close, like contact us or get in touch. Is it completely kind of verboten that they don't match exactly? Or if what, I mean, I don't know. It just seemed in a lot of cases they were very close, but it wasn't quite right. And I would have just let it go. But is that against the rules, or, you know, is that something?
Right. So that was that's solely, determined by what I had chosen to put in there. Real life, you might not encounter things like that where visibly it says contact us, but somebody put reach us instead. But I encounter these things in testing all the time where for some reason there's ARIA labels put on things for a reason I don't know. And I think a lot of times maybe some sort of library injects it, and developers are not aware that it's there. And so sometimes things get out where the visible text says one thing, but there's ARIA labels on there that are completely wrong. And you wouldn't know that the incorrect names are being conveyed unless you tested it. So someone like me or Kevin, accessibility tester, comes through and says, why are all these completely incorrect ARIA labels on there? And it's something that either just needs to be removed, or the developers need to make sure that they're updating the ARIA labels to match the visible text.
But as Claire mentioned too before, if you do contact us and something completely different, communicate with us, that actually is an accessibility violation, because the computed name must contain the visible name. And generally you want it to be first. So contact us, then the computed name could be contact us at the Office of Digital Accessibility. That's fine. But if you reverse those, then it's not fine anymore. And again, it goes back to using a different type of assistive technology called Dragon, where you're going to say, click, contact us. You're gonna say the visible name, but if you've completely overridden it with something else, you wouldn't be able to select it anymore.
Yep.
Jen says, Andy looks pretty useful for what I do. I use Andy more than the other techniques listed here. That's just my personal preference. We all use all these different techniques for calculating the stuff. I personally use Andy as my first go-to on all that.
Yeah, I usually use the accessibility pane in Chrome.
Just two different ways of getting to the same answer.
Yep.
I'm usually looking around with other stuff with Andy though at the same time, so that's generally why I go to Andy first.
Yeah.
I threw the quote when you were talking about JAWS guessing. I threw John Avila's quote in there, which is you don't get credit if JAWS guesses correctly.
Right.
JAWS is, over the last few years, has gotten way more aggressive about guessing and trying to guess what the right thing is. And sometimes it's more helpful than what you have put in your code, but often it's the wrong thing. So I wish JAWS was not quite as guessing as it is currently, but that's a whole other subject.
Right. But I mean, you have to consider that it's coming from the standpoint of,
Yeah.
real users use JAWS to accomplish their day-to-day work. And so if it can guess correctly, most of the time, then that benefits users. But it makes it more difficult for us testers to notice and identify issues. So that's when we really have to dig into the code.
Yeah, Mark asked what's a good screen reader app for macOS. There is only one. It's VoiceOver. It's built into the operating system. And it's the same on iOS. It works slightly different, but it's also called VoiceOver. But the Apple ecosystem is VoiceOver. And another reason for testing, JAWS is guessing correctly, but not all screen readers are going to do that. VoiceOver notoriously is not going to do that. It's going to it's going to be awful for you, whereas JAWS has guessed correctly, but VoiceOver did not. And that's just, we've only mentioned 3 screen readers here: JAWS, VoiceOver, and NVDA, and there's tons of others. There's a Linux system of screen reader program called Orca, which does things really weird, but that's the one they have. So.
And there's Narrator on Windows, which you don't even have to do any separate install the way you do for NVDA. You just get Narrator out of the box, and I think it has gotten a lot more powerful in recent years. So that's an alternative if you don't want to deal with installing NVDA. JAWS as a paid license, so that's a barrier